Let me just get on with it. Again, welcome everyone. Great to have you here with us. I am Cindy Lee from SAPIX, and I have the privilege of introducing to you Rachel Wu from Access Group. We have been requesting this webinar for quite a while, so we are very grateful to you, Rachel, to commit this time to us and to our audience. Rachel will be sharing with you a topic which we think is really important with regards to modern slavery in global supply chains, and which still exists in this day and age. So I am not going to cover much on that because I'm sure she is going to take you through why it's important, what can be done, and how to get it right. Rachel is the MD of Asia Access Group, and she's responsible for global business development as well. But I'm sure she'll probably tell you something about herself, a little bit more. So without further ado, Rachel, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cindy. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Wu. I am the Managing Director of Asia at Access Group International. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity, and also thank you for SAPIX to arrange this session on modern slavery. English is not my first language, but today, instead of fancy wording, I would like to share some experience in our previous 19 years in procurement from an operational point of view, how we see modern slavery has been evolving and how to tackle it as procurement practitioners. So without further ado, I would like to go into the presentation itself. And first is a little bit about our business, and I'm going to pass the floor to Cobus.
Yes, so my name is Cobus van der Wart, and I'm the CEO of Access Group. And really not to talk too much about our business, but simply to say that procurement and supply is a big part of what we do. And we do that across different markets internationally. So this topic of modern slavery comes up in all of what we do, but in particular in inbound supply chain work that we work with clients. And I want to say this, last year, I made a visit to Australia, and I met with 22 heads of supply chain or CPOs on the visit. I traveled between a few countries, and then subsequently I traveled to South Africa, and I met with 19 heads of procurement in organizations. And it is very interesting that out of the 22 companies that I visited in Australia, 22 heads of procurement talked to me about modern slavery. And in the same breath, I can say, out of the 19 meetings I had in South Africa with senior leaders in procurement, only 2 brought it up. And I was really puzzled about this. But I think it simply means that this topic is really a very valid topic. The injustice associated with modern slavery, the invisibility of it, the ease with which one can simply turn away and ignore it, makes it something that we should awareness about, and something that every single one of us can do something about. So I think it's for us really a privilege to have been asked to share some perspectives, and I think indeed Rachel will share some practical perspectives. This is a very big topic. One can run workshops, seminars, conferences on this. This is a very short segment today. I think just to focus on practically what it is, how it comes into our world in procurement and supply as professionals, and what can we do. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Cobus. Okay, so today we would like to break the session into 3 elements. Number 1 is to start from the beginning to understand what is modern slavery and how it relates to supply chain. And number 2 is how close is it actually to your business? It's closer than you think. And lastly, and also the most important, to share some experience on how we see modern slaveries can be tackled in your global supply chain. And as Kubis mentioned earlier, modern slavery is a very wide topic. It has many elements. It has the humane element, social element, individual element, business element, and so on and so forth. And today, we perhaps will focus a bit more on supply chain. And within supply chain, which is also a very wide topic, local, global, visibility, and so on and so forth, we are going to focus a bit more on global, where you cannot see, cannot touch, but you buy from. And we have done various CSR or modern slavery audits on site, and that's cross industries. So modern slavery risk does exist in, for example, mining, heavy industry, raw material components, and also light industry, especially fast-moving consumer goods related manufacturing. And so we are going to try to link it to some of the practical cases later on as well. So quickly go into what modern slavery is and how it's evolved. We have seen the awareness of modern slavery increasing worldwide in the past 2 decades. It's now even become more legislated, especially in UK, in Europe, and also in Australia. However, the awareness of modern slavery in the world is quite unbalanced. So what is modern slavery? Modern slavery usually slavery usually includes the following modules: traditional slavery, forced labor, debt bondage, child labor, human trafficking, servitude, and forced marriage. So as mentioned, it includes the social side, the human side, and also the business side. And if we see the scope of modern slavery, currently the most population impacted by modern slavery still sit in Asia Pacific and Africa, and that is a fact. That is also in line with the next slide, in which we illustrate the geographical spread and also industry breakdown, where we see more likelihood of modern slavery risks. As you can see from the world map, even though it's not 100% covered, usually modern slavery would happen in less developed economies, such as Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and so on and so forth, and also in perhaps relatively less value-added industries, including raw materials, FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, and raw material. However, if you look at the bottom of the slide, we also included some industries that we often come across in our modern slavery audits that shows potential risks in modern slavery. For example, construction material or construction industry, usually they outsource procurement a lot, and that's where you lose visibility, and that's where modern slavery risks sit. And components, of course, mining, and also steel and metal, bricks, rubbers, relatively less value-added industries in Asia and other parts of the world. Despite where you are, or whether you are in those regions and industries, modern slavery is actually closer to you as a country, as a business, as an individual than you think. So we can quickly go through 1 or 2 cases to illustrate how it directly or indirectly impact on your business and life. For example, we can first go into consumer industries, for example, food. We take the seafood industry as an example. This is actually one of the top commodities in the food industry. And Asia itself is one of the major supply base for seafood. And we see a lot of actually modern slavery risks in this, and it was reported also by different media throughout the year. And these two cases are related to reports by the end of last year in Southeast Asia, Myanmar and Thailand. As you can see, there is literally forced labors, especially in the fishing industry related, where we see fishermen are actually forced with restricted freedom to be on the shaft on a daily basis for over 16 hours without compensation. And if we quickly move to garment industries, which is perhaps more well-known or more common for modern slavery risks, you can see that in Germany, lots of famous brands, because they outsource manufacturing in Asia or other West Coast countries, then we see that because of lack of regulation, low awareness of modern management, often they were caught actually in modern slavery related scandals. And this reminds me, about 7 years ago, we got a phone call from a leading airlines in Australia. They were on news by media for prison forced labor, and then they immediately contacted us for a modern slavery related audit in China and also in Southeast Asia for handsets to be used on the plane and also uniforms for attendants. And during that process, we actually realized that even with sufficient procurement team, when you do global procurement or global supply, because of lack of visibility, it still can happen, and you usually know only after it is broken in media, which is quite risky for governance and also for business. And if we quickly go to the next session, so why modern slavery still happens in the current time? Because we see different development in different parts of the world. Some countries or regions perhaps are not mature enough for the government to have very holistic rule of laws or regulation to monitor the management. And for some companies, either manufacturing companies or end user who purchase from those manufacturers, they may have incomplete procurement policy, which did not fully cover best practice to tackle modern slavery. And we also see usually even a business realizes the risk in modern slavery because of various reasons, either lack of resources or enforcement in implementation. Usually the monitoring process is not as sufficient or efficient as one would hope. And of course, we have other reasons. For example, in Asia, because of the density of population and fears in competition, usually this very important element actually in best practice are usually deprioritized because of reality. And we also saw in recent months brought by COVID-19, the pandemic, the business world has been severely impacted or distracted. And therefore we saw in daily operation and also in global supply chain, there is more likelihood for modern slavery to happen or even get worse. To start with, the continuous economic impact has brought a lot of business on their toes. They're fighting for survivals every day, and therefore the management focus and sometimes the dilemma between survival and moral high ground is challenged. And also, we also saw rapidly growing unemployment rate in multiple countries. That also forced the workforce to accept worse conditions or deprioritize their voice on potential modern slavery in their daily life. And also, we also saw management teams' focus has been distracted by more urgent daily issues brought by COVID-19. And therefore, less in-house or external in-house resources or external support are allocated into modern slavery, as unfortunately deprioritized as a less urgent or less important matter. And now, in some countries where COVID-19 is perhaps better maintained or controlled, we saw economy is going through the initial recovery phase. That brought back, increasing orders, increasing employment, and so on and so forth. And that's another rush for people to pursue business interest instead of balance modern slavery, regulation, moral best practice matters. And during COVID-19, what we saw is COVID-19 related PPEs, for example, masks, glass, and so on and so forth. Those industry or players who wanted to participate in those industries brought new plant, new production lines, increase the capacity or capability of that manufacturing base a lot. So during that process, we had a lot of rush orders because of the actual needs. And in order to fulfill those quantity in orders and lead time in contract, we actually did during our either masks audit and inspection or isolation guns and so on and so forth, saw a lot of potential risks in irregulated conduct in HSE, in working time compensation and so on and so forth, which is actually heartbreaking. And I'm just going to quickly move to the next session to further illustrate that modern slavery itself is quite an in-depth concept. It has its obvious side. It also has the hidden side, which is often overlooked by businesses, either in awareness or not in awareness. The obvious side, I think we're all very familiar with. For example, the traditional slavery, no one intend to do that or do business with partners who are still doing that. From social side, forced marriage, child labor, human trafficking, and also, some easy statistics can be picked up from paperwork audits. For example, the number of employee or the number of staff in workshops versus the total actually output of the business. The hidden side or the not that obvious side is the current challenge, I think, for us and for most business to tackle modern slavery. For example, it's very hard to see on paper regarding restricted freedom of movement. It's very hard all the time to see on paper and in the language that you can understand how regulated or legal a labor contract is. And it's also sometimes hard to trace working hours if there's no proper documentation process in a plant. And wages and social benefits is very common in Asian country, that what you see is not what the manufacturer pays to the employee or to the government as social benefits. I will illustrate more detailed examples later by other case studies. HIC is another area that is very difficult to tackle if you are not on the ground. The photos you see, the lessons you see may or may not even be still valid or true. There are a lot of difficulties to tackle the hidden side. The usual barriers for companies to identify the hidden side is perhaps very much lack of supply chain visibility. When you indirectly buy from best cost countries via global supply chain, in other words, when you buy from traders or when you buy from one supplier, but then that supplier outsourced to various subcontractors that you do not have visibility on. And also, it can be easily caused by the fact that you're unfamiliar with local regulation and culture. In different countries, there might be different law regulating different thresholds, and also in different culture, people may or may not agree with you that they are conducting modern slavery. For example, last year about May, we visited Thai structural steel plant in Bangkok, and it is a well-known brand. And when we were walking around in the plant, we questioned that why we were not given a helmet, or we don't see any staff in the workshop wearing helmet. And they explained that this is not required by the law in Thailand for people working in a structural steel plant with crane on top of your head to wear helmet. So that's very different regulation, perhaps from people who are very familiar with South African law or China law or European laws. And also, even within one country, the regulation might be quite different between different provinces. For example, I use China to illustrate that in Beijing, in Shanghai, or in a remote village, in a remote province in China, the social benefits ratio is very different. And how to calculate that as the fair share the business should pay for their staff is also quite different. So without understanding the local regulation and culture, sometimes it's a bit hard to just use your standard or unified standard to say that it is modern slavery or not, or whether their conduct is correct or not. That often causes a bit difficulty later when you try to get buy-in from your suppliers for rectification. And quickly, also to mention that sometimes business often encounter, constraint in in-house resources, especially when you conduct a modern slavery audit. Often cross-function or cross-business skill sets is required. For example, procurement, auditing, HR, quite important, and finance and compliance, and so on and so forth. Sometimes businesses lean on procurement resources, and therefore it's a bit hard to allocate resources to modern slavery especially. And then also, we see actually a lot of business thus put modern slavery into their risk management and thus invest in online survey to tackle modern slavery, which is necessary. However, what we want to share here is that modern slavery sits in so many different corners of the operation. Sometimes it's very hard to reflect all the risks via just online survey or paperwork, in which people just tick or write in answers themselves. We do suggest that on-site audit, face-to-face witness, and also interviews, which I will also explain later, is quite necessary to verify what you see on paper. So maybe I can quickly pause here and just ask to the floor whether there's any questions so far. Can you still hear me? Is my internet still working?
No, quite fine, Rachel. Everyone seems to be very, very quiet this morning. I think they are listening to you and yeah, quite gobsmacked by what you are presenting. Anyone with a question, please feel free to unmute your mic and put on your camera if you have anything for Rachel at this point.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Cindy. So maybe I can continue.
Yes, you may, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. So for the next two slides, we would like to share some experience on how to identify modern slavery and also how to tackle it, especially the hidden side. To identify modern slavery, it does require a system. It does require both internal and external efforts. As you can see, we simplify it into four-step approach, but it is actually a lot more than that. But we need to start somewhere. So let's quickly go through these four steps. Step one is definitely very necessary, a self-assessment. As a business, before we set up global supply chain, before we purchase via global procurement, we need to have our own code of conduct and supporting procurement policies to include modern slavery related topics. And we also need to emphasize in our procurement policies the importance or the strategic importance of supply chain visibility, because it is one of the key barriers currently for business to tackle modern slavery. And we perhaps also need to go into our spend and supplier to understand the spread, the allocation in order to understand, according to the previous slide, the potential industry, the potential regions that would include more modern slavery potential risks, not to be stereotyped, but they are industries that have relatively higher potential risks than others. And for step two, because modern slavery is a very complicated risk to tackle, and also usually cannot be achieved within short term, and therefore the enforcement of implementation and ongoing monitoring is quite important. Therefore, we do need to involve senior management team in the procurement function as well as in the entire business. So from top down to build it into the culture, the value, and to build the surrounding supporting area, and to help with the implementation conducted by procurement or other divisions. And also, to identify modern slavery, we need to understand that very holistic management is required to be in place. We perhaps do need to allocate sufficient in-house cross-function resources. And when that is not available, perhaps a very professional third party, which is trustworthy and also objective, and especially on the ground, will be a very good support to your team. And the fact that they need to be on the ground is to conduct on-site audit. And the first step is, as discussed earlier, to identify some hidden side in modern slavery. Online surveys and paperwork is necessary as round one, but we do suggest that it's very necessary to have round two, in which we send teams via on-site audits to the plants, talk to the people, and verify what you see on paper. That usually is a part of supplier evaluation for most business, as well as supplier ongoing development. After we identify the risks in your supply chain that is modern slavery related, then we have 8-step simplified approach to help business tackle it as well. First, we would suggest that you map your supply chain, your spend, your category, your source of supply, your suppliers ratio, your visibility, and then we can prioritize some of the categories, suppliers to be added into the modern slavery evaluation. And then relevant risks can be also identified before we tackle the potential risks. And then step 2, we need to formulate the policies in which we need to have very clear code of conduct on modern slavery regulated within the business, clearly explained to different divisions and functions for implementation, and also engage with suppliers to set a benchmark and let them understand this is your requirement before any potential orders or even inquiries. And then it's quite important to set up whistleblowing system, like many South African companies are already doing, and also encourage that system into your suppliers in other parts of the world. And then is to quickly establish the process to identify the scope that you would like to evaluate on your suppliers, not just your suppliers, but also the upstream of your suppliers, which is their suppliers, their own suppliers for raw materials or potential outsourced components that will be later assembled into your product. And then capacity and resources is very important for tackle modern slavery. We often see companies struggle with in-house cross-functional skill sets because they usually would have modern slavery only as a part of their job, and usually the focus is shifted from modern slavery to other areas. And therefore, a very efficient way to complement to that is to evaluate, select, and develop your long-term external partners who can support on a very solid methodology-based, experienced on-the-ground audits. And that will also help you, as mentioned later in step 8, for long-term supplier development. And step 5, in our understanding, is very important to tackle modern slavery. Later in a case, we will further explain in some areas how we usually use modern slavery on-site audit as a tool to tackle risks. I'm going to skip it here and quickly go to step 6. Usually, to identify risks in modern slavery, to tackle it, which means to point it out to a supplier, is not the end of the story. A rectification plan is necessary, and usually the difficulties also sit in how to implement that. This is this we would suggest to be linked to your supplier annual performance evaluation. That is one of the very useful tools for suppliers to buy in and to motivate them to invest in this. This rectification plan usually covers various areas within the supplier's organization. So sometimes it is a big investment, and therefore a certain certain award system can be also set up. And most importantly, ongoing monitoring is very important, because sometimes what has been improved can very quickly set back to the original status if ongoing monitoring is not in place. And step 7, to create awareness. This is to individuals, this is within your business, and this is also within suppliers, not just the management team, but also the staff that actually manufacturing your products or processing your products. So we do need senior management team involvement. We need a lot of training to increase awareness, as one of the best practice in modern society. And we also need to provide support during the process for people who actually want to dedicate their time and efforts in improving modern slavery to be heard and to be supported. And then supplier development. Here, I would like to emphasize that today, the topic here is really not to say global supply chain is not good. Global supply chain caused modern slavery. Asian suppliers are not good. It's really not about that. This is one of the many risks that sit in global procurement and global supply chain. And the angle here is to be fully aware of and manage the risks, like how we manage payment, lead time, quality, and so on and so forth in supply chain. And therefore, the point here is not to send a team for auditing and nail the supplier and remove them from your supply list and put them out of business. This is to educate the supplier, because not all the time they actually do it in purpose. Sometimes they are even not aware of this, because where they are and education they have received and the industry best practice that they have seen in their own country. So this is to educate them, to provide guidance and support, and provide training, to give them a reasonable timeline to correct what they didn't meet in your requirement, and also link it to supplier performance evaluation to bring in potential penalty or award system to motivate supplier to go along. And maybe we can put the previous conceptual steps into a more practical case. So in our audits, I only take two examples. One is in the steel industry. The other is in the plywood processing plant. So those are typical, very typical industry. Or two companies that we audited on behalf of the client. One is state-owned company in China. The other is a medium-scale private company in a remote village somewhere in the middle of China. So this is the typical recipe or typical scenario for modern slavery to happen. The audits that we conduct is that we send usually 2 to 3 cross skill set combined team members. Usually you would have very experienced procurement resources, and also very experienced auditing and compliance resources, and also usually a person with strong HR background. These 3 skill sets we find as a combination usually maximize the effectiveness for audit. And then for on-site audit, the good thing is that we can actually witness ourselves and via key points and photo, we can explain what we see, what we hear, and pass it to the business who require such audits. So basically, for online audit, via labor, like child labor, forced or compulsory labor, associations, discriminations, and labor contracting, work time, wages, and social benefits, HSE, health, safety, and environment, we can basically have a 360-degree audit on each element of a manufacturing facility. And also, we would strongly suggest to add interview. That requires local language. For example, in China is the Mandarin, or potential specific dialogue in one province. In India, Hindi and many other official languages that they use. In Pakistan, the Urdu, and sorry for the pronunciation, by your local partner or external partners, local resources, use local language to conduct interviews on site. Those interviews are not pre-arranged. Usually our team members would randomly select interviewees on site from different business units or different functions within the supplier, from their documentation division, from their workshop, from their lab, from the HR department, to check on different elements that I just mentioned under the scope for auditing. And then this interviews is a non-name basis and is an independent interview. The supplier's management team is not allowed to sit in this interview. And Therefore, the interviewee is maximally protected. No one will know what they said unless it's us. And during such interview, and it's usually one-on-one individual interview, is also group interview. A different culture would react very different in different type of interviews. So we would have a questionnaire that asks about whether they're happy, whether they feel that they are treated well and fairly, and also many other detailed questions related to the scope of the audit. So there's two different streams that we run. One is our objective observation on site, backed up by the data or photo or documentation we collected on site. The other is to interview, not management team, but the actual people who work in different layers of the organization. These two streams will combine the final result of an audit and reflect where this company really is under modern slavery or potential CSR related risks. And the issues that we often find is under association, which means labor union is usually quite weak in certain Asian or other continent countries, and for working hours and labor contract. So people, because of competition, because of culture, because of personality, because of education, because of language, they are not fully aware what they are signing in labor contract, and therefore some manufacturers or suppliers manipulate them into a contract that they didn't really understand, and later on, feel that they are framed in freedom or so on and so forth. And also, we must be very mindful the different types of contracts that is allowed in different supply countries. For example, in China, by law, if you hire an employee in your workshop, then it's usually a labor contract. But in most cases, business would choose to have contractor contracts to avoid social benefits, to avoid tax, and so on and so forth. And coming back to working hours, suppliers would have many ways to increase their staff's working hours, especially in workshop when there is increasing order or urgent order coming into place. Some companies, for example, in steel industry, for example, or in machining industry, in certain countries, they pay salary at to staff in workshop, not by hours. They actually pay by the weight that they process or machining on a daily basis. So that puts the team in a very passive way to have to accept it. And they do want to earn more, so then they have to work for longer hours without proper compensation as per the law. And also, when the company compensates staff who work overtime or extreme overtime, they often find ways to change record on paper, which you can never see via online survey or via paperwork. And under wages and benefits, please be careful that sometimes the HR data you see from a supplier may calculate social benefits based on minimum salary in that city or in that province, instead of base salary, which is required by local law. There is a huge difference, and staff usually have very little voice that they can raise it to the bureau or management team that their voice can be heard. And under HSE, there are a lot of examples that we don't see good lighting or ventilation, especially in casting industry when where it is very dusty, and PPE is always a big issue. Sometimes the supplier do not supply or do not provide all PPEs, sometimes they do provide, but the staff themselves choose not to wear because it perhaps slow them down and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of hidden risks under HSE. And after we identify all the risks, usually we would work together with the business and the supplier to come up with a rectification plan. Usually we find a business would like to rush that plan so they can see improvement and place order. But it is somehow usually not easy to achieve within short term. So we usually set 1 to 3 months as a usual range of timeline for different type of rectification. But again, ongoing monitoring is very important to actually evaluate where the supplier is and whether supplier development and training has been achieved. This is only a few slides that to cover from what modern slavery is, how close it is to your business and supply chain, and also from operational point of view in global supply chain, usually what would be helpful to tackle modern slavery. And I think I'm going to pause here and then pass the floor to Harry, our managing director in Africa. Harry, can you please also share some of your perspective?
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I think you've really covered the topic of modern slavery excellently this morning. From my perspective, modern slavery isn't a new topic, but it is actually a new topic because it's always been there, but nobody's really been talking about it. And even in a lot of big corporates, it's a topic that isn't really addressed a lot or looked into, asking, are we compliant, etc. I think what we all need to be aware of is that modern slavery is becoming more and more of a focus of big major corporates. We're going to be faced with it if we want to deal with those corporates, and we've also got a corporate social responsibility on our side to make sure that we do things right, not only with using the right suppliers, but also doing it right in our own companies. We've recently seen in the last couple of years that modern slavery is getting more and more of attention. There's been a couple of instances in South Africa where corporate companies actually received penalties for modern slavery, where they didn't even think they are close to those kind of activities or even close to practicing modern slavery. There's been a couple of examples which is really on the grey area side, just highlighting how little we actually know about the topic in certain environments. Where modern slavery, like you discussed, it isn't necessarily just that it's with child labor and putting people in a factory, not letting them out, that kind of extreme situations. But in some cases, and you've touched on it, it's where we actually bind certain of our staff members with company benefits, giving them a car, giving them a house. And in some cases it's fine, but in some cases, if you do it in such a way that that individual cannot actually look at other opportunities, because then he'll be without certain benefits in his life. That is also a form of modern slavery. So that's really the area that I think we need to challenge ourselves on and ask ourselves, do we know what we need to know about modern slavery? Are we compliant? Do we actually know what our country's legislation about it is? And not only our own country's legislation, but also our suppliers and the countries they are in. This is an area that will definitely become more of a topic in the months and years to come. But it's one of those topics that you're probably going to find out in the hard way, that you're going to be slapped a penalty if you don't do it the right way. And we also do see nowadays that it's becoming more and more of a tender requirement to at least submit a document that you are compliant in terms of local modern slavery legislation. And once again, it's something that we don't really always know what we don't know. So for me to finish off, I can really motivate people just to read up a bit more about it, to understand the local legislation, to make sure that your company is compliant, that your suppliers are compliant. And if you don't have all the information, ask for help, whether it's Access Group or somebody else. Ask somebody to advise you on what is the local legislation. To look at your company, are you compliant, and to look at your suppliers as well. And most importantly, I think it's very important for us to show the world out there that we are taking the responsibility of treating our workforce the way that we should, according to local, well, firstly according to personal ethics, but also according to local legislation and guidelines that we need to. But thank you, Rachel. I think you touched on a topic today that not everybody is aware of, and not everybody has a lot of information about it. And I certainly learned a lot about it in the last 6 months. So thank you.
Thank you, Harry. So Cindy, then back to you. I'm not so sure whether there's any further questions from the floor.
I don't see anything in the chat at the moment, Rachel. I'm going to open up the floor now. Does anyone have any questions for Rachel or Gerrie or Kobus at this stage? Everyone's so quiet this morning. I think everyone is really shocked at what you've brought to the table this morning, Rachel. I know I for one, yeah, clearly I'm speechless. I don't have words, and it's like Gerrie said, you touched on a topic that people don't really know about, and it's never ever brought to the fore, and it's really been an eye opener for me. I'm sure the rest of the audience would concur. Anyone in the audience with questions?
Maybe Cindy, if I can just add one point. It's interesting that some countries, the UK, Australia, and some others, are actually legislating for companies, almost all companies of scale, to actually do modern slavery reporting. And if they don't, it is actually, punished very severely. So it maybe also tells us, again, that there is no natural awareness in all places. But in some developing countries, maybe even less awareness because the challenges are different from in developed countries. But clearly there is a groundswell to make everyone more aware and to legislate so that companies must make a formal statement. Official office bearers need to put their name to it to show what they've done to combat modern slavery in their businesses and in their supply chains. And there's actually, I think, still then this pulling people along. But in some corners, we are seeing that people are actually by themselves over time becoming more aware and acting, trying to do the right thing. So you can force people to do something, but you also want people to just do it naturally. So I think this is maybe just an early step to create awareness and maybe start a conversation, hopefully in time to come, in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, and further out, when we have these conversations in Johannesburg, for example, people are far more aware and are also saying, look, what can I do? Or already saying, look, this is what we have done. And I think, it's a journey.
Thank you very much for that, Kobus. I see we
Cindy.
Yes, Ken, morning.
Cindy?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, morning. Now, it just suddenly struck me, but if I'm a farmer and I give one of my laborers a cottage to live in, free, I mean, is that regarded as slavery, would you say? Because it makes it difficult for him to move on?
No, that's kindness.
Yeah, but I'm giving him a benefit that if he decides not to work for me anymore, he's got nowhere to live. He's going to have to go and find somewhere.
It's complicated, and I think one can...
Just something that Harry said.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think one can look at legal aspects, moral considerations. It may not be a simple issue, but I think it sounds to me that there was certainly no malicious intent. And perhaps we can, at least for the moment, we can be purist in our approach of thinking about this. But let's try and make the biggest difference in the most acute areas where one needs to make a difference. So I don't think that's going to be the first one to deal with.
Kobus, can I quickly comment on that one?
It's an interesting point.
Kobus, I quickly want to comment on that one because I think it's a very relevant question. And I read an article this morning on a court case in South Africa, actually about people within a workplace that were granted certain benefits. And the court case eventually came down to exactly what you mentioned now. What was the intent from the employer? So in some cases where they can prove that the intent is that I want to I want to bind you to my company. I want to give you benefits that will make it difficult for you to move on. Then something like that can go against you, and it can be a form of modern slavery. But if it's a value add that you provide your employer out of the goodness of your heart, or because it's something that's expected in the industry actually, then it's not. So it comes down to the intent of the employer or the individual. Was it a good intent or bad intent? And the courts actually look at that as well. But in some cases, there's gray areas where people don't really know whether the intent is good or bad unless you start digging into the detail of what you actually are doing. So yeah.
Ben, does it answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. It's a great area.
Yeah.
I think the intent is good.
We have a question in the chat here from Matthew De Smit. He says he's been looking at this problem for quite some time and trying to ascertain whether modern slavery actually is taking place, and with the knowledge that there are many challenges. So his question is this: do you have any standard templates or other questionnaires that you could share to assist SMMEs to start the process of self-evaluation and to assist our suppliers with their own self-evaluation?
Yeah, there are various templates, and we also have templates for just that question. So maybe just drop a note to us and we can engage with you. In fact, you can maybe on the screen see Rachel's email address, so that would be easy.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Cobus. Anyone else with any questions out there?
Can I make a comment?
Of course, go ahead, Tanya.
Not a question. I think it needs to be said that as supply chain professionals, it is all of our responsibility to make sure we understand what slavery is, what our legislation is, if there's anything like that available. In South Africa, it is our business and it's our responsibility to do something about it. Not turn a blind eye, don't pretend it's not happening. And from my perspective, I think we need to be making more of a fuss and more of an awareness about what's going on, because a lot of people either aware or they're not aware. They turn a blind eye. Some people are just don't know that it's really still happening. I mean, who would have thought in this time and day and age that it is? So my challenge is to all of you supply chain professionals to take responsibility and see what you can do to make a difference in this. Thank you very much, Rachel and Cobus. Great presentation.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more, Tanya. I'm going to ask for the last time, anyone else with a question or a comment with regards to today's presentation? Any takers? No? With that being said, Rachel, Cobus, Gerrie, I'd like to thank you on behalf of SAPEX for this very insightful presentation. It's been an absolute eye-opener for me and for everyone else. And we want to thank you for your time this morning and for sharing your insights with our audience. Will you make the presentation available to us that we could share with them as well? Okay.
Yes, we will.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us bright and early. It's not our usual time for webinars, but thank you very much for your time as well today. And again, Rachel, and to Access Group, thank you so very much. We'd love to see you again. Cheers. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.